for us. We are compared to clay pots. In both Jeremiah and Isaiah, we find the prophet going down to the local pottery shop. And every village of any size must have had one. And the prophet stands and watches the potter turning a wheel and making a pot. Something that takes a lot of skill. How many of you had art class and you thought that making a pot on a wheel looks so easy until you sit down at the wheel and you form it with your hands, and then you get to the point where, wow, it looks really good, and then the whole thing just collapses. That ever happened to you? Happened to me. I had pottery class in college, and I don't think I came out with more than one thing that looked halfway decent. It takes a lot of skill. And that's the image that the hymn that we just sang comes from those passages in Isaiah and Jeremiah, where God tells the prophet, you see how that potter is making those pots? This is how I form and I shape you. Each one of you. Unique and individual. And so the other half of the metaphor about us being clay pots, Paul offers us this wonderful image that the treasure that God gives us is put into clay pots. Usually you think of something valuable and a treasure as being put in a container that is decorative. Many of you probably have important keepsakes of one form or another that may be family heirlooms, and you keep them in a nice, secure place that's attractive. And you take them out every once in a while and you look at them and you show it to their children, whatever it might be. But Paul tells us that God does something totally different with the treasure that is put in us. Instead, it is put in clay pots. Just ordinary, average, everyday clay pots. In other words, us. And there's the irony, that the treasure that God places in each one of us, God places in fallible human beings. Even though God puts this treasure in us, God knows that we are imperfect. We make mistakes. We don't always live up to our ideals that we claim to hold. And we often act in self-interest. But God still puts that treasure inside each one of us. In Paul's other letter to the Corinthians, the 1 Corinthians, at the very beginning, he tells us a bit more about this, what this treasure might be. When I read these letters, I often wonder if these were metaphors that Paul often used in his preaching. And this is an idea that does pop up quite a bit, where he writes about human weakness and God's power. And the irony is the same irony that we find in this image of a treasure being put in clay jars. That God's power is not shown in human strength. Instead, God's power is best shown in human weakness, that none may boast. When we do things out of our own strength, and it is wonderful and it is glorious, and we boast about it, that's not where God's power is made manifest. Instead, God's power is best known when we do things that we don't think that we are able to do. The definition of grace that I gave you last week, that I'll remind you again, is that grace is the ability that God gives us to do that which we cannot do on our own. A strong person doesn't need God's help. A person who thinks that he or she is weak is going to be much more open to the strength and grace that God can give us. The word grace doesn't even appear in this text, but it suffuses. It is all through these words. It is grace that places this treasure, the light of Christ, the power of God. It is grace that places this treasure in clay jars. And that's not a bad thing. That the treasure God gives us is in clay jars. This treasure is indeed the power of God, the light of Christ. How ironic it is that God entrusts this treasure to we who are imperfect and make mistakes. And not only that, we are mortal. All that we learn and all that we become does not last forever. It is ironic that God trusts us with such treasure to bring the light of Christ through love wherever we find ourselves. And this treasure is not like that family keepsake that you keep in a shelf or in a closet somewhere and you pull it out once a year. Instead, it is a treasure that we are invited to take out time and time again, daily, and to use. The gifts and abilities that God gives us to bring this light of Christ into dark places. The invitation here is to not be afraid of the unknown and to not act out of fear, but to act in hope and trust and anticipation at the wonderful gifts that God has given each one of us. Amen.